We speak a lot about travel on this podcast. Flying around the world to visit other countries can be a wonderful adventure. But should we be thinking more about climate change and the effect we are having on global warming every time we buy a plane ticket? Find out what we think in this episode of
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with nearly 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. Hi Craig, how's things?
Things are very good, thank you. Today is a fiesta over here in Spain, and I want to thank you, Reza, for coming over here on podcasting on your day of fiesta.
And yours as well. I mean, everybody's off today. It's the 12th of October, which means national holiday in Spain.
That's right. What's first this week, Reza?
Well, let's get down to business. A bit later, we'll be talking about the planet, Craig and I. But first, let's hear a voice message from Rafael, who thinks we should think more about the planet.
Hello, Reza. Hello, Greg. I'm sorry because I'm going to be a little controversial, but I think in your podcast, too many times you're kind of making apology of traveling, how nice is traveling, how interesting, how much we miss. And I think for many people this is right, but I think you as a public people talking to many people, you should think a little bit about the planet, how we are damaging it. Last day, when you talk about national parks, I was thinking about it. And in my opinion, I think we should talk less about traveling inside our countries and traveling with our friends, with our family, places nearby. It could be a little bit less damaging for the planet. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rafael, for sending in your message and for giving us the theme, the topic for this podcast today about saving the planet, about global warming, and we're going to speak about that a bit later. But first, Reza, do you have any comments on Rafael's message, anything we can help him with in respect of his English?
Well, your pronunciation is generally very good. And the most important thing always in any message, can we understand everything you say? Yes, absolutely everything. So it's a good message. Having said that, Rafael, I did notice one or two things that perhaps we could improve. I think when you were talking about Craig and me, you said that as a public people, we should perhaps present this topic in a different way. As a public people, we can't say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the word people is plural. Remember, that's a thing people often forget. People is the plural of person. So you cannot usually say a people when you mean personas. Having said that, there is an exception. You can talk about a people when you mean a race of people. But that's not what you mean here. You mean como personas en el público. I think that's what you mean. I would say something like as people in the public eye. What about that, Craig? Do you think that's good? We often say that. Yeah. As people in the public eye, we perhaps would say in English.
Or we could say as podcasters, we're people in the public ear rather than in the public eye, although that's not an expression, but it could be. Yeah, we're in people's ears, so we're in the public ear more than the public eye. Was there anything else, Reza?
Yes, I think, Rafael, you said last day. I know what you mean. It's a mistake I often hear. What you should say is the other day. For example, the other day I saw my friend in In the
shit. In
the sheet of the shit.
What was your friend doing in the shit?
Good grief! I had heard that. What you should say is the other day, and it's usually informal. For example, the other day I saw my friend in the street, Bob. I hadn't seen him for ages. I saw him the other day.
Now, we have spoken about this topic before, nature and the environment. If you go to episode 96, and this might be interesting for you, Raphael, if you're interested in this topic, we spoke about nature and environment. So that's inglespodcast.com/96. We also spoke about renewable energy, and that was back in 284. So inglespodcast.com/284. It's a subject that we have spoken about, and I'm really happy that you sent in your message because it made me think a lot, and I'm very interested to know what Reza thinks about this. Questions like, should we travel less in order to stop global warming? That's something I've never thought about when I go on holiday and take a plane. And also, how much should we as individuals, that's you, listening to this podcast, also myself and Reza, how much should we accept responsibility for climate change? We've done a little bit of research into the history of climate change. The first thing I noticed on the internet as being a coming together of people to talk about possible climate change was back in 1987. There were a lot of deniers around at that time. People criticizing the scientists and saying that global warming does not exist. They denied global warming. That was the Montreal Protocol back in 1987. And then in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change happened. That's UNFCCC. But my personal first awareness of climate change was in 2005 with the Kyoto Protocol, where nations actually came together and promised to reduce emissions, to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that they were burning. And then in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement, which was the last major agreement between leading nations, and that required all countries to set specific emission reduction pledges. Now, the word pledge, Pledge, is a strong promise. If you pledge something, you promise to do it, but it's really, really strong. It's like a wedding vow or a promise that you will not break. So many countries pledged back in 2015 to reduce their emissions. And what's happening very soon, Reza, as we record this podcast in October 2021?
Well, the next thing on the agenda is the COP26. And that will be held in Glasgow, in Scotland. And it's planned for November of 2021. So this is October of 2021 when we're recording this. So very shortly after recording this podcast, they'll be holding the COP26.
So it's very much in the news at the moment, and every 5 years countries come together and they are supposed to assess their progress towards implementing or putting into action the agreement. And it's a process known as the global stocktake. Now, a stocktake is to evaluate something, to look at something and make an evaluation. In Spanish, you'd say evaluar, very similar. And the first global stocktake is planned for 2023, in 2 years' time. And these countries set their own targets. They make their own promises, and there's no enforcement mechanism to make sure that they meet these targets. So even though they're promising or pledging things they're going to do, there's no law, there's no accountability, there's no penalty or fine if they don't do it. So are governments doing enough, is my question. What do you think?
Well, first, before I answer your question directly, in my opinion, Craig, you said that there's no legal obligation for them to keep their promise. But it's even worse than that. They can undo the pledge, which is exactly what Donald Trump did with the Paris Agreement. His predecessor, the person in office before him, signed the agreement. But one of the first things he did when he was elected president of the biggest economy in the world was to say, no, I've decided that our country now are going to reverse their decision. And he publicly, not in secret, publicly said, we're not going to commit to what we said. So even if you do pledge as a government, you can later have a change of government and the new government says, no, we've changed our mind. And that happened with the most powerful economy in the world. So if the number one economy in the world reversed the decision, it really doesn't make things easy, does it?
Exactly. And it's this seesawing. Seesawing means going back and forth, changing from one way to another way, depending on the political atmosphere, whether it's a political party that's on the left or a political party that's on the right. As Reza just said, they changed their mind when the government changed. So as soon as Biden took over from Trump, he went back into the Paris Agreement. So it's not something as serious as this problem is, and we think it's very serious. It definitely depends on what government is in power at the time and what the policy of that government is. Something that's also very worrying, because you might be thinking, well, if we can't trust the governments, why can't we trust or maybe force or put some laws in place so that companies, businesses can do something to help global warming? And this really worried me when I read this on the internet. 100 companies, just 100 companies, have been the source of more than 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. That's according to a study, a report called the Carbon Majors Report that you can read in the show notes to this podcast at inglespodcast.com/387. Now that really shocked me, Reza, to read that the oil companies mostly, but not exclusively, 100 of them are responsible for 70% of emissions.
Me too, Craig. Well, I wasn't shocked that they were largely responsible, but I was shocked at just the scale. I mean, 70% due to 100 companies is mind-blowing. You know, because there are a lot of companies in the world and just 100? Wow, that did blow my mind, I must say.
So I know it's very easy to say, well, if they're not doing it, I'm not doing it. Why should I not buy a plane ticket and travel on holiday when these companies don't care about the environment? But would the average man or woman on the street pay more for eco-friendly products? That's the question. If the market dictates what the businesses do, that means that people on the street will probably have to pay more for products and services in order to stop these companies doing what they're doing. Do you think they would? Do you think most people would be prepared to pay out of their pockets to help global warming in general?
My opinion is that most people would not. I'm sad to say, but I think that's the reality. What do you think?
I agree with you. So I don't think the average man on the street really has much influence, because the companies are going to continue doing what they're doing because they're bringing the prices low enough, and people won't pay out of their pocket, their salaries, in order to choose the eco-friendly option.
When I say most people wouldn't be prepared to pay a bit more, let me clarify that I personally would, if there was a commitment, a pledge, an understanding that my money was going towards working towards a more sustainable method of producing energy and less pollution. I would be happy. But I have a funny feeling I'm the minority, because living in Spain, living anywhere in the European Union, you're already a relatively fortunate person. The vast majority of the world don't have as much money as you if you live in the European Union or the United States, and really they probably can't afford to pay much more. So we're quite privileged. We mustn't forget that. It's easy for us to say, yeah, I'd pay a bit more, but not in poorer countries.
Yeah, but I think it's also a question of where to draw the line. How far should we go as individuals to help global warming? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot since I heard Rafa's message. For example, would you consider what electrical goods you're buying, what electrical products you're buying? Because most of them you throw away and you create more things that harm the environment. So you really have to think before you buy anything and look at the company you're buying it from before you make a decision on what you buy. When you go to the supermarket, how many things have got plastic packaging around them? Would you be prepared to only buy eco-friendly food and not buy anything that's wrapped in plastic? Would you think twice before buying clothes to make sure that the company you're buying the clothes from operates in an eco-friendly way and they're not burning fossil fuels and it's a green factory? So there's so many things in our daily lives. So where do you draw the line is my question. I would love to buy an electric-powered car, but there's nowhere to charge it where I live. So I'm prepared to pay more money for an electric car, but I can't use it because I can't charge it because the government haven't provided points in the street for me to charge it. There's one charging point in my area, in the street, and there's always a car park there, so I can't use it. So it's literally impossible for me to have an electric car. And I would love to put solar panels on the building here and not burn fossil fuels and have gas. But would there be a sun tax? We've heard about the sun tax before, Reza. Have you heard of that?
No, what does that mean?
The sun tax was abolished. It never actually happened, but it was the idea that the government would charge you a tax if you put solar panels in your house or in your building to take energy from the sun and give you hot water and electricity, that you would have to pay a tax because then you were not paying the energy companies.
Oh, you're joking. They considered that, did they?
They considered that in some European countries. It was considered a few years ago here in Spain. They were going to fine people a lot of money if they didn't pay this tax, but people protested so much against it that in the end it didn't actually happen. But it just goes to show how difficult it is with governments and big business to be ecological friendly for the man or woman on the street.
Well, you said difficult. What do you mean by difficult? And you mentioned together in the same breath, governments and big companies. For me, there's the problem. I mean, what I'm saying is the very fact that the government proposed this sun tax, making people pay a tax for trying to be better to the environment and use the sun's energy. The very fact that they would do that, for me, is basically proof that they are in cahoots, which means in collaboration with the big companies like the big oil and gas companies. Because who else would want such a tax but them? Because they cannot control the sun. Clearly nobody, no company, and we never will ever under any circumstances be able to control the sun. That bothers them, I think. You can get access to something which cannot be controlled, so they think, let's deter people by taxing it. I can't see any other explanation. There could not be any other explanation that could ever convince me other than interference from big energy producing companies that would make me believe that the government would propose such a thing. I can't see any other explanation.
I agree with you. And many European governments are offering fossil fuel subsidies for farmers in the European Union. So they're giving money to farmers and helping them if they use fossil fuels. The government is not trying to change in many places to green energy, but they're actually helping people and businesses to use fossil fuels.
For me, it should be the reverse. They should be giving money to people who install solar panels. In fact, there was a brief period in Spain when they did. When people installed solar panels, they got a subsidy. And there was a while when they could sell their surplus, that means extra, surplus, their surplus energy. They could sell it back to the government, and the government bought it. But that was removed. So now if you produce surplus, bad luck. But that should be brought back. I mean, if you produce energy efficiently from the sun and you've got extra, why can't the government use that extra? Because I, again, fear that the big energy producing companies are using it as a means to sideline, that means to make it less important, to sideline that type of energy production, to deter people from doing it.
Shell Oil Company has a revenue of $187 billion, which is more than the GDP, the gross domestic product of countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo. So with a company that size, it's very difficult to change the way they do business. And this probably sounds very pessimistic, and I am very pessimistic. I really don't think there's a way out of this. I really think we're going to end up destroying the planet. And I'm sorry to say that, but that's how I feel. I'm sorry to you, Raphael. I am going to go on holiday next year and fly somewhere.
I can see why you say that, Craig, because one flight compared to the massive destruction caused by generating all that energy from oil and coal, really one flight for one person who's just flying once every year or two, it's not the end of the world, is it?
No, and I can hear people out there listening and thinking, but it's just exactly that, Reza and Craig. Everybody has to do their bit. That's what people are thinking. If we all do... No, it's not. It's got to come from above, in my opinion. It's got to come from big business, and it's got to come from governments. And then we can actually do something. And if you're thinking, well, Craig, maybe you shouldn't be flying somewhere. Reza, you shouldn't fly and see your family in Belfast. You should maybe go there on a bicycle, perhaps. I would say, as I said before, next time you go to a shop and buy something, next time you go to the supermarket and everything's packaged in plastic, just think about what you're doing as well.
Well, Raphael, who sent us this message, is of course not the only person who likes to take an interest in the environment and try to stop climate change. Many of us do. And many celebrities, many famous people publicly urge us. To urge, U-R-G-E, means to speak about something as urgent or to get you to do something urgently. So many famous people, they publicly urge us all to think about the consequences of our carbon footprint, how much pollution we make in the things we do. And perhaps some people think we should pay them special attention because they're famous. A lot of people listen to them. But are they really any more responsible than the rest of us? I mean, in my opinion, for example, if the story is true about Bono, it's a very famous story, the very famous...
Bono from U2.
Bono, there's a guy in Bono called a politician, isn't there? Yeah, not that Bono. Bono, the singer of U2, he famously is said to have, I say is said to have, that means that's the story, but I can't guarantee 100%, but I'm pretty sure it is true.
Allegedly.
He allegedly, in case he finds me.
We don't want the lawyers to sue us.
Can you imagine Bono's lawyers being on to us? Bono, allegedly, he is said to, and it was reported in many, many very reputable sources, he is said to have reserved a seat on a plane, not just for himself, but a separate one for his hat. Now, Raphael, your question was basically, is it justified for me, Craig, or anybody else to fly on an unnecessary holiday? Because strictly speaking, you could say the holiday isn't necessary as part of your daily life.
Well, just to be clear, I think Rafa's really saying we should think about travelling more locally with our families and maybe not going so far. I think that's more Rafa's point, to keep it under control and to have fewer holidays abroad.
Okay, fair enough. Even the idea of just keeping it under control, still it's the idea of trying to be responsible. Mm-hmm. Well, for me, Raphael, I definitely am very clear about the Bono story. Having a seat on a plane for your hat is not justified in any way. It can never be justified because a person could have been sitting on that seat, and that person, instead of sitting on that seat, now has had to get a seat on another plane and use up more fuel, etc., because a hat was there. And obviously a hat, well, I say obviously, but Bono might not agree. Obviously, I say a hat that doesn't deserve its own seat, particularly when it can go on your head when you're already on a seat. So for me, that type of thing is totally irresponsible. And then the fact that Bono speaks a lot about climate change, it's something that genuinely interests him. I find it very, very hypocritical. I just think it's unacceptable to be telling people one thing and yet doing something else.
You think people should practice what they preach?
Practice what you preach. That's a good expression in English, a good expression which goes back a long way. Don't just say something, do it. Don't ignore what you tell other people to do. And as I'm sure we'll all agree, preachy, that's the adjective, which comes from to preach, to predicar. Preachy hypocrites, people who say one thing but do the other, they're very annoying people. People are always telling you, oh, you should do this, you should do that, don't do that. Yeah. And then you see them doing what they told you not to do. I find that incredibly irritating. What about you?
But to be honest, I'm surprised that Bono didn't have his own private jet to take him and his hat wherever he wanted to go, because many people who are in positions of power and people who have a lot of money do have their own private jets. What do you think about that?
Yep. And you know, Raphael, I'm sure you have paid a lot of attention to this, probably more than me even, but it's something that I do pay attention to. I see climate change talks at really important meetings like the G7 summit meetings, Davos, where they talk about money-based things, but also issues related to the environment, which tie into banking and that type of thing. And lots of those people will have arrived in their private jet, as Craig says, and they're very important people with very demanding, that means they're very specific about what they want, very demanding tastes and needs, and they're used to living a very luxurious lifestyle. And you hear stories of hotels supplying all kinds of really exotic fruit and vegetable and meat and ingredients which have been flown in from all over the world to meet the needs or the demands of these VIPs, these very important people in Davos, etc., who are talking about climate change, and yet they're having their oysters flown in from another country. The hypocrisy is just outrageous.
Although, yeah, I take your point about that with the food and the drink, but some people might say that these politicians, these world leaders who are trying to help to improve climate change, they're very busy people. They don't all have time to take the boat and the train like Greta Thunberg did when she went to the conference. What do you think about that?
I don't accept it. I think they've got used to that idea. You can get used to any idea, but it's not true. We have got used to the unfair idea that, yeah, in the world, a lot of people have to be poor. Personally, I don't accept it. I do not accept that idea. It is reality, but I refuse to accept that it must be that way. It is that way because people are prepared to put up with it. And it's the same with people going around in private jets saying, oh, I haven't got time to travel any other way. They do. They could do it if they wanted to, but we've got accustomed to the idea that it has to be that way. But I really don't believe it does. Craig mentioned Greta Thunberg, this young girl who's on the news a lot now these days. And a lot of people have started criticizing her. And I'm sure they're desperate to find something hypocritical in her actions. And they probably will someday, because nobody's perfect.
If they don't, they'll probably invent something.
They just invent it anyway. But I have a lot of time for Greta. I think she's great. And I really enjoy the way she mocks very important people.
What does to mock mean?
To mock, M-O-C-K, is to make fun of, to ridicule someone. So she has been invited to really important platforms where world leaders have been there, and she's mocked them. She has said things like, oh, climate change, blah, blah, blah. Carbon footprint, terrible, blah, blah, blah. This blah, blah, blah is what you say in English when you're saying like, yeah, you say these words always the same, but who's really listening? Who cares? You're just saying it just to say it, but you don't really give a damn. And she's actually said this blah, blah, blah. You talk about blah, blah, blah to the faces of the people who do that. She has had the nerve to stand up in public and mock them. Say, look, stop talking with your blah, blah, blah. Actually do something. And I really think there she's hit the nail on the head. No more talking. Just do something. Stop talking about it and do it.
Well, let's wait and see, because next month is the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, and we'll see what the countries have to say there. But I want to say thank you to Raphael for sending in his message, because it really did make me think on my position as somebody who does speak a lot on this podcast about traveling. I don't think I'm going to change anything, Raphael. I'm still going to travel when I can, the way that I used to. Unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, that's not possible at the moment, but hopefully I will be able to travel again in the future. And until I see a big change from these big businesses and from the governments, then I'm going to carry on the way I have been. But now we'd like to hear from you. It's your turn to practice your English. So what do you think? How much should we as individuals accept responsibility for climate change? How much of a sacrifice are you willing to make to improve the planet? And where do you draw the line on what you do and what you don't do as far as climate change is concerned? Reza, how can people contact us?
You could send your voice message to speakpipe.com/Inglespodcast. Or you could write to us. You could send an email with a comment or question about what we've been talking about today, or anything you like. You could write to Craig@inglespodcast.com, or me, belfastreza@gmail.com.
And we also invite you to visit the Mansion Inglés online store, where you'll find some products and courses to help you improve your English. Go to store, that's store.mansioningles.net. We'd also like to thank all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast on Patreon. You can join our Patreon program for as little as $1.20 per month. That's including VAT, the value-added tax. And by doing this, you get instant access to recent transcriptions. Go to Patreon, patreon.com/Inglespodcast for more details. Now, we know you're probably out in the gym or riding your bike or walking or taking the dog out for a walk, so you might not have written that down. Everything we've spoken about today, including Greta Thunberg's YouTube video, can be found in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/387.
It would be lovely to name all our Patreon supporters, but we haven't got time. So what we normally do is say thank you to the most recent supporters of the Patreon scheme who've joined us. And our most recent supporter is Arancha. So a big thank you to Arancha and to all our Patreon supporters.
Yeah, thanks, Arancha, and thank you to all of you. We were possibly a bit too pessimistic this week, but I do promise that next week we will be a lot more optimistic, because we're going to be speaking about lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. So COVID generally was a negative thing, but we're going to find good things that have come out of that situation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends so we can get more people listening. Thank you for listening this week. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's bye-bye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.